Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about Uranus turning retrograde on August 24th. Now, Uranus in astrology is known as the planet of revolution and change. That's because whenever Uranus enters a sign or is triggered by transiting aspect, it will upset the very foundations of your life. Essentially, what it does is it sort of enters into a room and kicks over the game board, sending all the carefully placed pieces flying into the air, never to be recovered again. So Uranus is basically known as the planet of revolution and change. That's because Uranus was discovered in the year 1781, the exact midpoint between the American War for Independence and the French Revolution. So not only was Uranus the first of the modern planets, sometimes referred to as the moderns, it would be followed later by Neptune and Pluto. Not only was Uranus the first of the modern planets, the other two, discovered very quickly afterwards, were Neptune and Pluto, but Uranus, the planet of revolution and change, overthrew the traditional classical order of the planets. Originally in astrology, there were 7 planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And Uranus, when it entered into the astrological pantheon, overthrew that order, overthrew everything that had been known about astrology, and opened up the door to everything that could still be discovered. So whenever Uranus is very powerful in a chart, this is what it's going to do. It's going to basically disrupt. You could almost think of Uranus as a wild ride on the wheel of fortune. Whatever's on top moves to the bottom, and whatever's on the bottom swiftly moves up to the top. But Uranus isn't just the wild card in astrology. Uranus is also associated with the idea of revelation or enlightenment. Indeed, Uranus was discovered at the apex, at the crescendo, the climax, the high point of the Enlightenment in Europe and then in France. When you remember that America was the great democratic experiment, no one had ever tried a government like America's before, and America was very much a product of the Enlightenment. So this is what Uranus stands for. Not only is it disruption, revolution, and change, but it's also the idea of trying to align what's going on the planet Earth below with what's going on upstairs in heaven above. Now, this isn't a sort of as above, so below type of thing. It's more comes from the ideal of Plato, which was the idea that there were certain eternal truths or virtues governing eternal truths or virtues, that if mankind would only lift its sight and follow these eternal truths, these stars in the sky, then it would be led to create a beautiful society on the world below, basically to make Earth mirror the purity of heaven. Well, at least that was the ideal. So Uranus is not only the planet that sort of disrupts what's going on, but it's also disrupting what's going on to bring it into alignment with what's supposed to be going on. And what's supposed to be going on is that our civilization on this planet should be embracing the highest in all of us rather than the lowest. That's what should be going on, according to the planet Uranus. Now, when Uranus turns retrograde, retrograde is a backwards motion in the sky, or rather an apparent backwards motion in the sky. Retrogrades are pretty much understood as acting in the opposite way than the way that they normally or typically behave. So there's a lot of sort of like hope around Uranus turning retrograde, that perhaps Uranus, the planet of revolution and change, will stop being so revolutionary and so changing during the time that it's retrograde, which is roughly about 5 months. So in other words, what's been sort of a wild and woolly ride on the roller coaster now becomes something more peaceful and stable and low key now that the planet is turning retrograde on August 24th. If only that were the case. Essentially, what I've seen happen with Uranus retrogrades is, Uranus is the planet of revolution and change. It's the it's the wild ride on the wheel of fortune, that what's up is down and what's down comes flying up. So there's a sort of erratic quality, which I've been describing. Well, when it turns retrograde, it's almost as if, well, there's a maxim with Uranus. Let's put it simply. There's a maxim with Uranus. Uranus is the planet of turnabout, of reversals in direction. So with Uranus, you get this idea, particularly with the Uranus retrograde, that turnabout is fair play. So that's the idea to keep in mind between now and January, when Uranus comes out of retrograde, which is the idea of turnabout is fair play. In other words, if you have been agitating for change, if you've been on the side of revolution, if you've been trying to bring about a radical transformation of the landscape in your life, well, then there's going to be a turnabout during this period of time that Uranus is retrograde. You're basically going to be hearing from those who you've been trying to overthrow or supplant or revolt against. Okay, so this could bring a period of time in which people in positions of authority push back. Okay, so with revolution, we're sort of reminded of people with, I don't know, I always go back to, storming the Bastille and then Versailles, people with pitchforks going and storming the barricaded walls and calling for equal rights and all these sorts of things. Well, during the period of time that Uranus is retrograde, those who had been stormed against or those behind the walls are going to push back. They might push back in a repressive sort of way, or they're going to push back in a way of sort of demonstrating or reinforcing their positions. So, of course, the great question is, which side of the revolution have you been on in recent months? Okay, so as I just said, if you've been on the side of people agitating for change or bringing about change or changing the rules of the game, then this period of time when Uranus is retrograde means that either the rules of the game will be changed back, or you will be facing people who are pushing against that, who are saying, enough of this unpredictability. We need to put down something that's more sustainable or something that's more stable. Or if you've been pushing for great change or radical shifts in direction, there's going to be pushback from people saying, you know what, I'm really kind of sick and tired of putting up with this. You've been acting badly or loudly or coarsely, and so I'm sick and tired of putting up with, and now I'm going to reassert my place. So that's something that if you've been on that sort of radical side, whichever side that might be, it's so difficult to determine who's radical. We all know who's radical. Those are usually the people who are very extreme, but there's no longer a sort of political division of that. There can be extremes on both sides, and they can be just as radical. Okay, so there would be this pushback during the period of time that Uranus is retrograde. But let's say you've been on let's say you've been the one in charge. Let's say you've been laying down the law at home with a heavy fist, telling your teenager to be in by a certain hour, or, monitoring the comings and goings of members of your household, or ruling your department at work, with an iron fist, and with no sympathy or no sort of leniency, doing everything by the book and making everyone do that as well. Well, during this period of time that Uranus is retrograde, you're going to see that flip up against you, if that's indeed what has been the policy that's been calling the shots for the last number of months. Like, let's go with about 6. So you may see that sort of suddenly fly up against you, and instead of always getting your way, you may feel that people who work with you or people who share space with you are revolting against you. So basically, Uranus is like a pendulum. It swings one way and then it swings in the opposite. And so what happens is that when it turns retrograde, it's gone too far in one direction on that pendulum swing. And now during the retrograde, it's going to swing back. You're going to have the reaction. You're going to have the response to all the radical changes and developments that have taken place during the period of time that Uranus has been direct, which has probably been since about the beginning of this year or thereabouts. So that's one of the things that we could very much expect to see in this period of time that Uranus is turning retrograde. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you've been, on the side of revolution and change, comes the great question, well, what are you going to replace the current way of doing things with? In other words, you can be like, I've been oppressed or suppressed or controlled or not listened to, or all these sorts of things, okay, which is okay. There are grievances, and this is motivating you to make these changes in your life or to overthrow the set structures in your life. But what are you going to replace those structures with? There are lots of people who dream of being in charge, but imagine for a moment suddenly being in charge. What would you really do? You would be in charge of an apparatus. You would be in charge of the way that things are done. There would still be great expectations of delivery by certain deadlines and certain promises being kept and pledges being recognized. So what would you suddenly do if you were in charge? All right. It can be sort of easier to be the person agitating for the change rather than the person who's actually in charge. Okay, so let's say you're suddenly put in charge. What would you do? What would you do that would be different? And what would you do that would be in keeping with your vision? Now, let's put this down into a day-to-day life. This could be a very enlightening thing. This could be a very worthwhile thing. If suddenly I'm going to take charge of my life, well, or I'm going to take charge of the way that my life is set up. Well, what would I do now that I'm in charge? This is something that you're going to get a glimpse of. This is something that you're going to get a glimpse of, particularly around September 11th of this year and January 5th of next year, because these are the two times when the sun will be trining, forming a trine to Uranus in Taurus. The first one, the September 11th, is Sun in Virgo, trining Uranus in Taurus, and the second one is the Sun in Capricorn, trining Uranus in Taurus. So this would be something very much taking place at that time. And it's something to keep in mind, sort of staying with our cattle theme of Taurus. It's one thing to sort of fire shots up in the air and to get a stampede going, okay? But it's another thing to herd cattle. All right. And that's something that's going to be very much resonant during those two dates that I just mentioned. Okay, so what happens a lot of times to revolutionaries, to people who, lead the charge to overthrow the structures that are in place? Well, a lot of times what happens is that they themselves are trod underfoot when the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. One of the things that one of the historical stories I'm thinking of here is Robespierre. Robespierre was a great agitator in the French Revolution and a great leader who really wanted to establish this perfect utopian society and was really one of the loudest voices in overthrowing the king and the queen of France, and they rolled out the guillotine, and they chopped off the heads of the king and the queen, and chopped off the heads of all the nobility, and they went through this purge of everyone who was in charge. It was even called the Reign of Terror. But as Robespierre tried to set up his own government based on this utopian vision, this vision of an ideal republic, what also came to bear was his indifference to the human cost of what had gone on, that his indifference to the human cost that had been paid for the price of this vision of an ideal society, and then also of and what had taken place in the instilling of it. So this caught up to him. Okay, people were enraged and outraged with the loss of life and the tumult in society, and the way that, you know, the people who had taken charge after those who had been in charge didn't sound too dissimilar, and so they were overthrown. And Robespierre was himself beheaded at the guillotine. So what can happen when you have these turns of the wheel? And Uranus is this turn of the wheel, which is called a revolution. Remember, revolution is not just overthrow, but revolution is the word that we use to talk about the full turn of a wheel, or the full orbit of a planet around the sun. When a planet has completed one orbit around the sun, it has completed its revolution. So this idea of the turning wheel is very much Uranus. So another thing to keep in mind during this time is when we sort of face the responses to revolutionary actions that have been taking in the past few months, one of the questions that we might be facing is, did I let the genie out of the bottle? Did I let the genie out of the bottle? And letting the genie out of the bottle is this idea of, did I allow something to happen that I cannot change, or that I cannot reverse in its direction? You know, it's kind of almost like a snowball effect. Did I start a change in my life, and the snowball's gone down the hill, and it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and I can't control it? It's completely out of control. That's the sort of thing that we'll all be questioning in our lives as we question this relationship between ourselves and authority. You know, is there an authority over us? And as we question that authority over us, or as we question the authority that we exercise, are we exercising authority fairly? Are we exercising authority with compassion? Are we exercising authority with an idea of what the consequences to our decisions are going to be? And are we working in the big picture? Because whenever you're talking about Uranus, remember, it's the revelation as well as the revolution. It's this idea of a big picture, and that there are certain guiding principles, or there are certain guiding truths that there are up above. Something to keep in mind about Uranus being one of the co-rulers of Aquarius is an air sign, and air signs believe in law and order. You don't always see it played out in them all the time. There can be a flippant side to law and order, or a revolutionary side to law and order, or sort of like working out the loopholes to law and order, or bending even the rule in a way of getting around it. But at the end of the day, the air signs are law and order oriented, and Uranus is a planet that's connected to the grand plan. Okay, these divine truths that I've been talking about. And so something that's going to be very powerful that's coming up, something that's going to very much challenge this pendulum, this flip. Okay, Uranus is kind of like the flip. If you were revolting, now you're in charge, or if you're in charge, now you may be revolting, or, you know, what are the consequences to affecting these changes, to overthrowing these authority figures in your life, or being an authority figure, and are you going to be overthrown because you haven't been wielding it right? You know, and that can go from your position at work to the way that you manage your home to politics in your country. Okay, but something that's going to be very powerful that's coming up is there's going to be an opposition that takes place between this time that Uranus turns retrograde and this time when Uranus comes out of retrograde. And that opposition will be taking place between the Sun and Uranus. It's a very powerful opposition on November 9th, and it follows the lunar eclipse on November 8th. So these ideas of, if I agitate for change, what have I unleashed? This idea of, did I let the genie out of the bottle? This question of, now that I'm in charge, how am I taking charge, and how will I govern over the area of my life that I'm in charge of? It could be a department at work. It could be your home. You could be voted to be head of the student council or your block committee. How do I wield that authority? And how do I wield that authority during a time of such volatility? This Sun-Uranus opposition that will be right there at the midpoint of the retrograde, right there on November 9th, following a lunar eclipse, is going to be very, very powerful. So how are you governing these forces in your life? If you're agitating for change, do you have an idea of what that means and what that looks like? If you are resisting change, are you resisting change because you're trying to be a moderate figure in some way? Or are you resisting change because you're being stubborn or blind? And are you going to be overrun by that change? Are you going to be overrun by the very thing that you have set in motion? Heavy questions, I know. And I sort of apologize for the heaviness of it. But at the same time, my job as an astrologer is to alert you to it. You can't change the course of what's going to be coming down the pike with the planetary energy. You can't duck and cover. You can't avoid it. You can't say this isn't going to happen. You can't avert it, but you can with consciousness, and you can with awareness hear your voice, in this tumult. Follow your guidance at a time when the moral compasses are out of whack and being crazy, and to follow that, and to not only navigate your way through that storm, but perhaps come out on the other side more enlightened and more attuned to the way that things should be going on when Uranus comes out of its retrograde on January 5th.
Hi, this is Becca Tarnas.
And I'm Rick Tarnas, and we're really looking forward to teaching an upcoming workshop here at Astrology Hub on September 21st.
If you want to be the first to know when registration opens, make sure you're signed up for the Cosmic Insider at astrologyhub.com/insider.
We look forward to seeing you there.
Thanks for tuning in to the Astrology Hub Podcast Network. If you love the show, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, review, and share it. And if you don't know how to do that, here's how you can leave a review in Apple Podcasts on iPhone. Make sure you're on the landing page for the Astrology Hub podcast and not an individual episode. Scroll down to the bottom until you reach Ratings and Reviews. Click one of the 5 stars under Tap to Rate to leave a rating, and under the most recent review, tap the Write a Review button. And if you're on another device, just find out how to leave a review on whatever podcast player you use. Then, share what you love about the show or how it helps you navigate your life. We'd love to hear your stories. And by doing this, you make it possible to make shows like Horoscope Highlights happen every week. Thank you again for tuning in, for being a part of our community, and for making astrology a part of your life.